We are live on YouTube and on Zoom. Thank you for those of you who are joining us on Zoom. Um, I'm really excited to be here tonight. We've been talking about this for a while with writer and organizer Dania Rajendra and professor of multi-ethnic U.S. literature at Indiana University and author of the recent book Citizens of the Whole World, which I highly recommend. It's incredibly well written and really helped broaden my perspective and understanding of the Jewish left, Benjamin Balthasar. So we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to try to stop the three-way conversation at about 7:10, and then folks who are on Zoom will have the opportunity to ask questions. If you're here on Zoom, you may note that you are not currently able to come on video or off mute, and that is by design. When we get to the Q&A portion, I'll ask you if you have a cue to raise your hand in the through the React button, and then I'll let you come on video and off mute. And all right, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dania and Benjamin. And we're going to get started. So I think that the concept of the Jewish left can be a confusing one. I think that you both agree with me. And so I'd really like to start personal, especially because you're both from multi-generational Jewish left families, which isn't a given. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for your Jewishness, how that left alignment from your family informs the core of what it means for you to be Jewish? I think if we can start with Benjamin, that'd be great. And then we'll go to Dania, and then we'll also just chat.
Great, thanks. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Andy, for the lovely introduction, also for organizing this. Thanks everyone for attending, and also thank you, Dania, for joining us for this conversation. As Andy mentioned, I came from, you could say, a pink diver baby family. My grandparents were members of the Communist Party in Philadelphia. My grandfather had helped found the Communist Party affiliated post office union, NASPO, which was also the first racially integrated post office union that was also banned during the Red Scare. My grandfather also lost his job. And so I grew up, my mother was not officially, you could say, a member of a socialist organization or communist organization, but definitely progressive. And also I grew up with my grandparents. They lived into their 90s. So I got to spend time with them actually as an adult. And actually my first book is really actually about them. It's kind of a poetic memoir of listening to their stories as a young person. And so I think in a couple of ways. One is simply that everyone has a kind of cognitive map, I think, of what it means to be Jewish if you're Jewish. What are your sort of historical lodestars? What are your historical points of reference? What things are passed down? And also a lot of Jewishness. Yes, there are synagogues. I did go to a synagogue growing up, and my rabbi actually was fairly progressive as well, even though it was a small town in California. Um, but a lot of Jewish life is passed down on the Seder table, right? So it's passed down through families, it's passed down through stories. And there's this always kind of mix, you could say, of memory and history that is as much about your extended family as it is about, the Torah or, official Jewish history or what your rabbi says or what you might get in a Jewish studies class. And so I think what that simply meant for me as a writer and also an organizer and also a teacher, an educator, is that part of my, you could say, upbringing was just some sort of thinking of the left, its project is part of my kind of intimate history and also just very normal, right? So it is not something exceptional. And that's something that I find, when I was writing my last book, there was a big divide between, Jews and on the left who I interviewed, between those who grew up in left-wing families intergenerationally and those who didn't. It doesn't necessarily mean their politics today are different, but their sensibility of where they come from, what they remember, again, what their guideposts are, etc., are very different, and their approaches to things are very different. But also, I would say too, this is not a new story. So one of the people that I interviewed for my book, Dick Flax, he's one of the founders of Students for Democratic Society, wrote a memoir with his partner. He's a sociologist. At UC Santa Barbara, and he did actually a famous study in the 1960s about the so-called generational break between the old left and the new left. And what he actually found is there was no generational break, that most of the new left activists that we remember are people who grew up in vaguely progressive families, sometimes red diaper families, sometimes just sort of liberal families. And many of them actually did not think they were breaking with their parents. They thought they were fulfilling what their parents had taught them. And so this notion that there's some kind of intergenerational rupture is something that has been challenged for a long time. And that actually, I think a lot of kind of left-wing Jewish history, or even liberal Jewish history, is oftentimes expressed through intergenerational family stories. I had a family who was a garment organizer. I had a family who marched with King. We've always voted Democrat. These kinds of stories get passed down. So,
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Yeah, Dania, go ahead.
I think it's going to be the theme that my answer is similar and also different from Benjamin's. I too am a red diaper grandbaby, and I too, well, I like to say that I was born a leftist and came to synagogue membership as an adult. And I generally agree with Benjamin's point that there's too much made about intergenerational rupture, but I will say that joining a synagogue felt like a real betrayal to my mother, and she truly never forgave me. But sorry, Ma, material conditions change. What are you going to do? So for me, being a leftist is what makes participating in ritual Jewish life meaningful and sustaining, and perhaps most of all, interesting. And for most of my time as a person who belongs to a synagogue and has been exploring ritual observance, I have felt really trapped by the pervasive understanding and consensus that synagogue Judaism is real Judaism and left praxis is not Jewish or not really Jewish. And that's just right-wing nonsense. It is a testament to the power of right-wing ideas in so many Jewish spaces. And if we have learned nothing from the last 3 years, I think we can learn that it is undeniable that left political work is absolutely real Judaism, and we should talk about it in those terms.
Can you unpack that just a little bit more? What does it mean for left praxis to be Jewish, or for someone's Judaism to be left praxis? How does that tangibly manifest?
Just a quick clarifying question. Are we taking turns, or do you want Dania to start, or whoever leaps in first?
Whoever leaps in first. Let's try to be as organic as we can be in the
fair enough.
Okay, I'll go first, Benjamin, and then you can take it second. This question. So I think it is worth saying extremely directly that it is only the left, not the Jewish left, but the ecumenical left, that made it possible for leftist Jews to protect and keep vital the central ethical tenet of Jewish tradition, that every person is made in the image of the divine. American Jewish institutions, the religious institutions, the mainstream institutions, they jettisoned that, and they jettisoned it in the service of Zionism and neoliberalism. And so when we think about what I just said about how left praxis can be Jewish practice, it doesn't have to be. I think we should really take seriously how, in order to preserve and keep vital something so important about Judaism, required a multi-faith and no faith at all, and multiracial, multi-gender left.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so it's actually funny. I was in an interview several months ago, and the host asked me, well, isn't it kind of an article of faith that, no pun intended, that we all assume sort of Jews are liberals or there's a historical presence of Jews on the left? And I was really kind of tickled by that question because that assumption today no longer seems terribly operative. We have the first Jewish state since antiquity, I guess, and it's committing a genocide, and it's run by essentially a far-right government, and has been for quite some time, and seems to only be getting worse. And then, of course, the U.S. Jewish institutional world, at least the well-funded Jewish institutional world, the ADL, the AJC, the federations, et cetera, are nominally liberal, but are guarding Israel as their primary objective, and that means that they have taken many right-wing stances or refused to defend things it would seem very obvious for them to defend, even right-wing attacks against Jews, right? So, the deafening silence around Trump's anti-Semitism, Musk's anti-Semitism, Bovino's anti-Semitism, et cetera, to say nothing of, the anti-Semitism of Christian supporters of Israel, again, is kind of deafening. So there is a long historical connection between particularly, European, but also Middle Eastern, and particularly also American Jewish working classes and the left. And for reasons that Dania has suggested, that the left was seen as the protector, basically, of universal rights. So the term comes, of course, from the French Revolution. And the inheritors of the left, whether they're Black Jacobins and C.L.R. James telling that as people overthrowing slavery, the abolitionist movement, or the left defense of Dreyfus in the late 19th century, the left was seen as a guarantor of universal rights. And so, of course, Jews who were minority subjects in most places they lived up until the foundation of the state of Israel felt that the left was basically their best hope at securing universal rights, religious freedom, freedom from pogroms, etc. And so, not only was there the Eastern European Bund, the Middle Eastern, so everything from Morocco to Iraq, Jews played an outsized role in left liberation movements in those countries, the colonial movements. And then in this country, probably actually, it's kind of funny to think of it, but actually the United States was seen as actually the largest and most developed Jewish left kind of in the world. In fact, actually the Bund learned a lot from the American Jewish left that really emerged out of the labor movement and the mass waves of immigration in the 1880s. And I think the principles were basically the same, right? So the left, you could say, that begins in the abolitionist movement in the US was about a kind of guarantor of basically universal rights, but also a protector of ethnic minorities, supporter of the working class, against things like imperial domination, etc. And so a lot of Jews basically, you could say, assimilated, so to speak, or learned to be Americans through the crucible of this labor movement, right? And I think right now what we're seeing is the sort of battleground between which Jewishness we're going to remember. We're going to remember that Jewishness, you could say, became American through the labor movement, through supporting the idea of universal rights, or are we going to remember a Jewishness that was basically refounded in the Cold War through Zionism, which is about a kind of Jewish supremacy? And I think right now we're seeing that battle in real time. What does Jewish liberalism mean? What does Jewish leftism mean? What history do we look back to, et cetera? And right now it's an unsettled question, and I think we're basically fighting over it at the moment, right? So,
Yeah. So you asked some questions there that I think both of you might want to answer in some ways. So I kind of want to start from today and then work our way back in history a little bit. And this is a maybe a more controversial question than some of the people watching will understand. But how would you delimit the contemporary Jewish left? Like, what makes someone part of the contemporary American Jewish left, and where are those lines?
All right, you first, Benjamin.
I'll go first. Yeah. That is a complicated question. I tend to like to not to like to not delimit. I'm kind of anti-sectarian. I'm a '90s child, so came in the moment where there was really no functional left, and so everybody was welcome aboard. But I think you can make some guideposts at the moment, right? So there is something. Again, I always want to answer things historically. So there is something coherent you can call a Jewish left really up until the 1980s, right? And the sort of emergence of the Zionist consensus, the collapse of the New Left, the breakup of SDS, the collapse of the civil rights movement, the Reagan counter-revolution, all these things sort of end the kind of coherence of the left writ large, right? But I think in a particular Jewish context, it's the ascension of the Zionist consensus, right? That really captures basically Jewish liberalism and creates a kind of dividing line between who's an acceptable Jewish subject and who is not. So I think in a very basic way, right now the dividing line is Zionism, right? So if you are a Zionist, you are not on the left any longer, and that I think is actually very recent, right? So to me the vote, the DSA vote in 2017 and the emergence of DSA as probably the most prominent left-wing organization right now, that is socialist organization. That vote basically drew a line that says, basically, if you want to be on the socialist left, even the liberal socialist left, the sort of Mamdani socialist left, you have to be an anti-Zionist. And I don't think there's any left organization any longer that still supports Zionism. DSA was actually the last one, right? So, and I think that question has been called essentially, during the Mamdani campaign within Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace also took basically an explicit anti-Zionist position around the same time, a little bit earlier, but basically saying if you're going to be a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, you have to be an anti-Zionist, or at least you have to accept this is an anti-Zionist organization. So I think right now that is the dividing line. But I think there's other dividing lines as well, right? Obviously, there's a question about the Democratic Party, right? And a kind of critique of the Democratic Party. Are you part of the Mamdani wing that embraces socialism, or do you still see liberalism as a project that has kind of legs? Do you associate essentially your progressive politics with organizations like Trua that are not necessarily explicitly anti-Zionist? Do you support BDS? I would make an argument that the world basically has forced that question upon us, right? That the centrality of Israel, of Zionism, as a central question on the left globally and the left in the United States means that if you are Jewish and want to be part of a kind of global left or even an American left, you basically on some level have to support a critique of the Israeli state, Jewish supremacy, the apartheid state of Israel, et cetera, at a kind of minimum, or else you're really in a very practical sense basically breaking solidarity, right? So if you can't, and I think historically speaking, there are moments when global questions emerge as these kind of dividing lines. There's the Vietnam War, there were civil rights, right, in the 1930s,
Africa.
the movement, and I think today Zionism is one of those questions. So,
thank you. Yeah, Dania, what do you say?
Well, I too am a child of the 90s. So I would say like living through the flip of like the Zionist, like when I was a young union staffer, like to be openly anti-Zionist was as potentially career destroying as like being openly socialist. And like that's why we have this idea of being openly socialist, which I think no longer exists anymore, but existed for a long time. Kids, thank you for fixing that. And so I guess I would say like the Jewish institutional world sets the Jewish political center of gravity so far to the right, artificially far to the right, that the Jewish left in that context seems to mean what Benjamin was saying, like the genocide of Gaza by Israel is wrong and should stop and be stopped. And also ICE kidnapping and murdering our neighbors in the United States is also wrong and should be stopped. And I agree. I agree with those positions. And also that can encompass a huge set of people and a huge set of ideas about how to make change. I think it's further complicated because like the media environment uses the word left to describe everyone sort of from Nancy Pelosi to Zohran Mamdani and beyond. And like that making the word meaningless only serves the fascists. And by no definition of the word left would that apply to Nancy Pelosi. And I think that in this context and in that confusion, it's easy to lose sight of, especially if you didn't know, especially if you're newer to the left, that the left has a meaning, right? Like to me, the left means it refers to people who are generally in agreement with the ideas that capitalism is a destructive world system, that the working class is the motor of history, that class conflict is fundamental to capitalism, and socialist revolution is desirable. And so those kinds of commitments, and from there are my anti-racist commitments and my anti-imperial commitments. And from those are where my third generation anti-Zionism comes from. That said, no one gets to pick their parents. And so many people are discovering these ideas and these traditions through Palestinian solidarity. And that's wonderful. That's amazing. That's fantastic. And also, like, anti-Zionism is a position. I think it's an important position. I think it's a righteous position, but it is not a whole politic. Like the left and left ideas are so much bigger. And so I think some of that is a little confused in the Jewish context where so many people are coming out of an institutional environment that is frankly authoritarian and imposing authoritarian ideas that include but are not limited to Zionism.
Yeah, that, thank you. That like very clear, like setting the kind of tone for what it means, and it does not necessarily mean anyone who is not a Republican, right? Which is, yeah, I feel like how the media environment kind of uses the word left. And so the idea that like anti-Zionism is a position and not a politic, I agree with, and is different today than it was, when this organization, the ACJ, was founded in '42. Anti-Zionism meant something quite different. Um, and one of the things that I found really interesting in your book, Benjamin, and something that we have argued about, and that I've argued with a lot of people about, is this idea of peoplehood and Jews as a kind of like universalized ethnic group, which is a stream underlying some modes of Jewish left understanding, and is one that the ACJ was founded on, like completely rejecting. And I'm continuing to carry that torch of pushing against peoplehood as a normative stance. But there is like an interesting moment in the new left, which, like, for those who don't know, is kind of like the '70s, when you've got organizations like Chutzpah and Brooklyn Bridge Collective that you write pretty extensively about, that are able to kind of maintain this particular Jewish like identity as a left organization without really slipping into Jewish nationalism. And so, and this is also a question for both of you when it comes to this aspect of Jewish left identity in America. How is it possible to maintain that kind of secular political stance without it needing to be undergirded by a kind of totalizing like ethnic Jewish identity, or in a more pointed way, like a form of Jewish nationalism?
Sure. Well, I guess let's sort of put it at me first. So first I want to say I agree with Dania. I was trying to be sort of welcoming and inclusive. But yes, if you're not an anti-capitalist and a socialist, you're not really, in my opinion, at least. And it's actually very funny because I mean, DSA, I'm a DSA member, and there's always this kind of confusion about that because a lot of the most popular DSA politicians call themselves socialists or DSA members, but are basically left liberals. And sometimes people will come to DSA meetings and then sort of look in, wide-eyed surprise, you're a bunch of communists, because you actually want to overthrow capitalism, so anyways, yeah, so it's complicated. And I think the left is reforming itself and rebuilding itself in various ways. And so I want to kind of create a kind of open space. But yeah, at some point, like I said, one has to see that we're having all of these problems. We're brought here together because of the things that the bourgeoisie is doing to us on the planet. But to your question about chutzpah and BBC, secular Jewish identity, so I tend to think of these things not normatively, but historically, right? So because I think on some level, there is no normative way to be Jewish, right? There are, so there's so many ways of being Jewish out there in the world. Every time someone says this is the proper, true way to be Jewish, I get very nervous. So I think of these things historically. How did Jews in the past do this? How do they think about their identity in relation to their left politics, in relation to solidarity, global solidarity? And so going even back to the heyday of the Jewish left in the 1940s, a lot of, obviously, the Jewish communists were anti-religion. I wouldn't call them secular exactly, because their modality of politics is not secular, as they were, trying to basically refound and reform life from the bottom up, right? So they did not like Weberian administrative capital. So in some ways, they were not secular in that regard, but they were anti-religious and fought actually a lot with the ACJ, right? So a lot of people that I cite really did not like the ACJ, even though they both agreed on Zionism. And they felt that if one defines Jewishness simply as religion, first of all, you're discounting most Jews in America. In fact, there's a little funny note. People often decry the low synagogue attendance today. It's actually much higher today than it was in the early 20th century. Like, early 20th century, like nobody went to synagogue, And
it was never high. There's this weird idea that back in even the 19th century, Jews all in America went to synagogue. They never did. It was always low. Yeah.
Today we're actually at a high. So we're at a peak. Synagogue going Jews should pat themselves on the back. Job well done. So, anyways, so they said, well, if you define Jewishness as a religion, you're simply discounting most Jews, empirically speaking. But then they also said, there's something about a kind of Jewish secular tradition. And again, I use secular in this other sense, or kind of humanist, not necessarily, again, this Weberian sense. This humanist tradition that goes back to Maimonides, that goes back to Spinoza, that is carried through, the Haskalah, and humanist in this kind of broad sense, that it places human activity at the center of the world. So, Spinoza and Maimonides, their sort of, you could say their innovation was to say, yes, God may have created the world, but human activity is at the center of it, and it's up to humans to repair it, right? And so they would say that, a kind of Jewish left politics or socialist politics or humanist politics comes out of that tradition, and they want to claim it, right? And so I think in a very particular, so they would refer to the thing called what they would call progressive Jewish values. And we might call that something else today, but that's what they called it back in the 1940s, to refer to this kind of broad Jewish humanism that, again, they would point to, again, people like Spinoza, but also, Jewish abolitionists, the Jewish socialist left, Jewish, small d democratic politicians and politics, etc., as inheritors of that tradition, but also Jewish literature, Jewish art, klezmer, etc., right? So, and they, thought about Yiddishkeit as a kind of language of this kind of tradition. So when Chutzpah and BBC come around, Brooklyn Bridge Collective, not the British Broadcasting System, when Brooklyn Bridge Collective comes around, they're hearkening back to that, but they're reforming it in the 1970s. They know the old left is dead, right? It's been sort of wiped out by the Red Scare, by suburbanization. And so they're reforming, very conscientiously trying to reformulate a Jewish identity in relation to the rise of, you could say, left-wing identitarian movements. So they're very much in engagement with the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, the Combahee River Collective, feminist movements, and they see the sort of movements of the left are embracing identity politics as their way forward, right? And so they're saying, okay, we want to be part of this left. We want to be in relation with the Black Panther Party. We want to be in relationship with the anti-fascist left, with the working class. But we also want to basically practice, a kind of Jewish politics. And they thought a lot about diasporism as the kind of name of this kind of socialist Jewish relationality that is formed in relation to the other, as Judith Butler says, right? And so that was their way. But they're also not anti-religious. The other sort of big break that they make with the old Jewish left is, they had what they called the Moishe to Mao continuum, which is their sort of joke, basically, about, where they placed members of their collectives. And so, the Mao were the sort of, Marxist internationalists, and a lot of the members of these groups were Marxists, but there were also the Moishe, which were the sort of soft cultural nationalists. And most of these people were members of groups like Chai, which were religious sort of, you could say Jewish renewal groups, right, in Chicago and New York City, that were trying to kind of form a new Jewish spirituality. And so, and they were also trying to be inclusive. The Communist Party, were right on many things, but they were really wrong on LGBTQ plus issues, and we're kind of a homophobic organization. Although, funny enough, very gay. There were so many gay people in the Communist Party, and there's wonderful work that's been done on why that paradox existed. But they were trying to be more openly, Chutzpah and Brooklyn Bridge, tried to be openly queer, etc. So I think a lot of the kind of new Jewish politics that we see today with Jewish Works of Peace really come out of that interregnum of the 1970s, where they're trying to refashion a kind of Jewish humanism to these kind of new identitarian politics, and also to new Jewish experiments with religion, right? The sort of Waskow generation of kind of a left-wing Jewish expression, and to reformulate that into a kind of soup, that can encompass all of these things. And so I think, to some degree, if you want to think, where does JVP come from? Yes, it comes from housing organizers in Bay Area in the 90s, but it comes, I think, from this moment of kind of reformation in the 70s, if that's a very long-winded answer to your question. So
thank you. Yeah. And Dania, do you want to add anything to that? This like way of kind of articulating a Jewish left identity that doesn't rely on Jewish nationalism necessarily to understand oneself. Like, how does one thread that needle?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, it's like actually being interested in Judaism, whatever that means. Like that could mean left praxis, right? But our friend, the historian Dan Berger, wrote this really funny, very scathing review of Chuck Schumer's book on anti-Semitism, which I recommend. I mean, I recommend Dan's review. I do not recommend Chuck Schumer's book. And Dan talks about how in the book, Schumer sort of reduces Schumer reduces Judaism to, they tried to kill us, let's eat, and also support Israel. And or maybe I would call it like one pogrom after another. And like, it is true that subaltern identities involve experiencing direct oppression. And also, like, that is not all there is to a subaltern identity, any kind of identity. And I think understanding Judaism as an interface with hatred is a very poor understanding of the richness of our tradition and what it can offer, and what we might make of it. So like in some of that is the interplay of the universal and the specific. And I think, Melanie K. Kantrowitz and others were sort of genius to pick up on the diaspora language, just as Stuart Hall is genius to pick up on the duality of being a member of a diaspora. And I think that in many ways, being insiders and outsiders at the same time is a superpower. And it is a force to expand our political and social imaginations. And I find, as is studying Torah and learning about Talmud and Jewish folkways, especially as a leftist, I too love the heritage of the old left and the new left. And also, we are short on ideas and inspiration for transforming this world into the one of our dreams and the one we might have to win. I think the 19th and 20th century templates for revolution don't suit our moments in many ways. And so there's a lot in many religious traditions to re-encounter from this place of deep destruction. And I feel it would be foolish of us to jettison what we have as Jews for the rest of the world at a time when we're all desperate for more sustenance and more imagination and more ideas of transformation. So I don't know, Andy, if that totally answers your question, but like, I think the short answer is like, the more I learn about the Jewish traditions I didn't learn as a child, the more excited I get about everybody's traditions being in conversation without losing any of them.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm gathering from what both of you said, interestingly, and is and also I have to fully credit you, Dania, for helping me understand this over the course of many months now. That like the um, the legibility of the kind of Judaism that both of you grew up in and that your book is about, Benjamin, is very different from how it's so different, in fact, from how tend to think of themselves in mainstream institutional life and Jews tend to be thought of because of the racialization in the history of anti-Semitism, which I think like both of you are kind of um, pointing at. Um, and it's because this kind of being Jewish is way more, and because it's leftist as well, is about praxis as opposed to like some kind of necessary like internal inheritance or like some kind of passive thing. It's like you're Jewish because you're doing Jewish, and you're doing Jewish because you're seeing what you're doing in the world as Jewish and relating it to other Jews who have done similar things before, right? As a like, which isn't religion, but also isn't ethnicity. It's something else. There's just not a like a simple word for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a somewhat idiosyncratic take on myself, but I've always felt the secular religious divide is actually very un-Jewish, and
Mhm.
that I was raised to sort of think of Jewishness as an orthopraxy. That is, Jewishness is what one does, right? So whether that is halakhic ritual or being among other Jews, right? That there is a kind of, you could say, praxis to one's Jewishness, and that thinking of Jewishness as a faith tradition was basically a kind of Cold War adaptation of the Judeo-Christian, right? So again, that's my idiosyncratic, perhaps, upbringing and understanding. But also, you know, the thing I always point to is my rabbi growing up was an atheist, and nobody thought that was particularly weird, right? And he would talk a
Right.
lot about, you know, that this was not particularly weird. And I tell people that sometimes, you know, they're Jews and they're scandalized, but it made a lot of sense to me. And it made sense to me, I think, through that tradition that I was discussing earlier, if one thinks about this kind of humanist tradition beginning kind of with Maimonides, right, in which, you know, the world making basically is done through the interrelational subject of Jews with other Jews, right? So, and you know, Spinoza very much is about this sort of interrelational intersubjectivity, right, of being, and so I think that's where diasporism picks up on this kind of Jewish tradition. So diasporism, in one sense, obviously, as Dania mentioned, Stuart Hall, right? I think it's kind of the poet of the diaspora, right, and the diaspora subject. Um, but, you know, in some ways, this kind of notion of diasporism, the relationality with the other as being kind of intrinsic to a Jewish tradition, is on some level, yes, it's a kind of Jewish incorporation of identity politics of the 1970s and a way to rethink the left in a moment of transition. But it is also an inheritance, right? That's kind of both a practical inheritance of being a liminal subject, right, wherever one goes. But it is also the inheritance of this kind of intellectual and you could say moral tradition, right? Or even substantive tradition of what Jewishness means. So yeah, so I think in some ways, you know, one of the ways that I would say, it's not that I think that there's something essential about being Jewish to being a leftist, And obviously, Israel is proving that, that assertion quite wrong. Although I was raised, my mother did tell me that. Anyway, sorry, mom. Anyways, but I think that there is something that maps onto one of the things that I got from Chutzpah. The Chutzpah Collective was something that Myron Perlman, one of the founders of Chutzpah, told me, and someone I knew personally in Chicago, that he talked a lot about what he said is that Jews have what he said, a kesher with the left. Kesher is Yiddish for bond. And that for him, that kesher is not only historical, right? That the notion that there's something about, again, the kind of strive for universal justice that will create a place for Jews as a minority group, but there's something about kind of Jewish thinking, a kind of substantive presence of Jewishness that fits onto a global left project that is constantly reincorporating and reforming itself in relationship to praxis, real conditions, real communities, real needs, and a real horizon of justice. And there's something in a Jewish tradition that is very useful for that project. It doesn't mean every Jew is leftist, but that leftist Jews have, as Dania suggested, possibly one resource, right, for that, right? And I think this goes also back to the question of diversity, right? This is why you need cultural and ethnic diversity, is because everyone kind of brings a little bit to the picnic. And I think that's one of the things that Jewish history can bring to the picnic, right? So,
yeah. I mean, to me, as a person who learned the left stuff first and the Jewish stuff as an adult, Jewish practice seems extremely praxisy to me, right? You read the text, you reread them, you read them in community, you interpret them, you argue about them, you rethink them as you age and as the world around you changes, and you keep talking, and then you try new stuff, and then that informs the way you understand the text, and you understand it's meaning making. And I think that to go back to the beginning of our conversation, a thing that I find I find that people who didn't grow up with this left tradition may not understand it as deeply meaning making as it can be. And if you read Vivian Gornick's Romance of American Communism, which anyone interested in the questions of the left should absolutely read it, run, don't walk. She really captures how people found not just the people with whom they made meaning and the communities with whom they made change, but in that project, many of them found a connection to the numinous. And I think that too, I mean, we're not the only ones. Like, the Catholic left is a real thing. And I imagine they also find a connection to whatever that means to them. And certainly the Black radical tradition involves quite a lot of religion. And one thing I would add to my book list that I keep making here is certainly Hammer and Hoe. If you like Benjamin's book and want to explore the ways in which Americans have made a syncretic left culture and ideas, Hammer and Hoe is definitely a good place to go. And in that way, I think that idea of diaspora helps link us to those traditions, the ones that are Jewish and the ones that are connected to Judaism or Jewish people, and the ones that are further afield that we could make connected to us, as did Spinoza and Maimonides and all of those folks and more.
Yeah. And you picked up where I wanted to ask my final question. Folks who are here in the Zoom, if you have a question or you want to think of a question, that will, in about 5 minutes, I'll ask y'all to do so. And if you have one, go down to the react button and hit the raise hand button so that I can see that you want to. Okay, awesome, Michael and Carl. Great, we got a line going. But before we go to them, and specifically to what you just said, Dania, with regard to like the kind of syncretism that is essential to Judaism, I argue. And Benjamin, you were speaking to this too, especially in bringing in particularly Maimonides and Spinoza, both of whom were like excellent syncretists, even if people don't necessarily notice that, is that to me, this is part of what like diasporism is about, is this syncretism and that being a like integral piece of Judaism. And I'd love to hear you, Dania, before we go to the other questions, just share like a word about the relationship between this like this idea of diasporism, Jewish diaspora, and the left. Because Benjamin, you've talked a little bit about it, how it plays out in your book. And again, I would recommend anyone read Benjamin's book because he goes into like a really wonderful look at Jewish diasporism. But Daniel, we've had so many conversations about it. I wanted to give you kind of the last word on diasporism before we go to other folks.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm feeling extra reductive, I feel like diasporist is how we say internationalist in 2026. Um, and I think that's for a lot of reasons that Benjamin could do a better job of recapping the history about. But I will say that in my experience organizing on the Jewish left, what I have discovered is that too few of us Jews know anything substantive about other diasporas and how other communities like work with memory and forgetting, which is such an important part of Benjamin's book too, and how diaspora makes ways of being and tradition, and including politics, possible in ways that may no longer be possible at home. So, for example, maybe this is what you had in mind, Andy, like, I didn't say this, but my dad was from India. And one of the things that has been so moving to me about Zohran Mamdani's politics is the way he embodies this incredible post-colonial, secular, socialist hope for remaking Indian society that existed in those first decade, 2 decades after independence that no longer exists. India is in the midst of a horrific fascistic makeover. And so like that kind of open, syncretic, freely mixing possibility, like that doesn't exist in India anymore. But like when Mira Nair talks about it and when Zohran talks about it, you can see that continuity. And similarly, like the syncretism and the overstated difference between secular and religious, I think, is also bound up in some of the more reductive ways some of us on the Jewish left think about using the term diaspora, and like misses the possibilities, that there's so much more possible when we are in deeper and more meaningful relationship with people who are like us and people who are not, and that's only possible in diaspora. And that's rad.
Thank you, Dania. All right. So, quick plug. If you have enjoyed this conversation so far, if you've enjoyed other things that the ACJ has done, please do consider giving to the ACJ. There is a link in the chat to do so if you would so choose. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, it's givebutter.com/American-Council-for-Judaism-INC. You can maybe type that out. That would be nice of you if you did. So, Michael, you had your hand up first, and I have to ask you to unmute, allow you to unmute, and I can't ask you to turn your video on, which is annoying. So you will be a disembodied voice. But Michael, would you like to ask your question?
That is a photo of me. So you guys are rad. Thank you for having this. And I will try to focus on a question. So I don't think there necessarily are other diasporas whose current identity is, for a large part of that diaspora, to support and defend a supremacist colony. Yeah. So what happens next, and I imagine this is for like 50 years of next, is Jewish identity will be around anti-Zionism. Like there will have to be a big part of what we do is the correction for what we have done. And A, do you accept that as a premise? And B, what do we do with all of the religious leaders who have led us down this murderous path? And like, I don't even want to be in a room with a lot of these people, let alone have them get pensions and have them speak for my community or for my family. So you can hear my rage. Sorry.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, I'm gonna
You want-
start.
Do it.
And also I'm gonna try to speak to the question that El Aiden maybe put in the chat about the Zionist, anti-Zionist coalitional necessity. So one thing I didn't say about the Jewish left is that I think it is a reasonably functional left liberal coalition, and we should be pretty psyched about that. And we need those. And I've been writing a lot about coalition politics with Rebecca Vilkomerson. And Michael, we wrote a piece called Holding Liberals Accountable is a Strategic Necessity. And I think, lost, we don't mean, by which I don't mean like someone's random grandmas or whomever, cousins, change their minds. That's fine. Like, fantastic. Welcome. There is no teshuva required. I think that for, as we think about what we'll need to have democracy take root and flourish in a more real way in the United States and elsewhere, we will need to think about the ways in which liberal leaders failed us and what teshuva looks like. I mean, I also would recommend people read Simone Zimmerman's piece from this summer in Jewish Currents about this question. And I think that the best way to change many people's minds is to change the political conditions. And what we saw in New York when Mamdani won the mayoral race is that the far right, Jews on the far right, like Jonathan Greenblatt, lost their minds. And the more they lost their minds, the more people who were on the fence about Mamdani came to the Mamdani coalition, that they are the ones polarizing, and we are glad to receive more people into our coalition. And that there's a great essay in Convergence magazine about the fundamental challenge to democratic, like there will likely be a Republican right-wing coup, and social left-led movements are the best way to stop that. And that means left leadership. And that means that some people need to follow when they think they should be leading. And that too is politics.
Yeah. Benjamin, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree with Michael and Dania. I think it is absolutely essential right now that, first of all, the Jewish left focus on the question of Zionism, not only because, it is this kind of, moral and human obscenity in front of us, But because I think the Jewish left has a real role to play. And it's kind of, again, I think it's been kind of thrust upon us, you could say, by history, but it is ours, I think, and we need to pick it up. And part of it is, it's awkward, actually, in movement spaces. It can be awkward that Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest and best funded anti-Zionist organization in the United States right now. And that gets awkward, with our partners, right, on the left, particularly with Palestinian Americans, who feel like we kind of drown them out a little bit, right? But I think, like I said, that to the extent to which JVP can be politically effective, right, can take some of the heat off of Palestinian organizations, right, and can also, I think, address in particular ways organizations like the ADL, protect candidates like Mamdani. We do have, again, this incredibly rich, important, and vital role to play. And I think we need to be absolutely clear about it, right? That we are not in any way in coalition with the ADL or anybody like that in question, and that we also have a role to play, I think, in the Democratic Party in particular. Jews have, an outsized role in the Democratic Party as well. As far as what we do with these people, I think one answer, obviously, as there was Ariel Angel had the op-ed in Jewish Currents about forming new Jewish institutions. Obviously, the ACJ here is one of them. Jewish Voice for Peace is another. Jewish Currents is another one. There's another magazine that's starting, Der Spectre, which has been around for about a year. So I think creating new kinds of Jewish institutions and a Jewish left is going to be absolutely necessary to not be, completely swallowed by these organizations like the ADL that have tons of money and enormous amounts of power and are aligned now actually with the state in very formal ways, right? And so we have to think of them not only as Jewish organizations, but as state-aligned organizations, right, that are aligned with the Israeli state and also aligned with the American state, and thus a very practical part of the American empire, right? So, this is not a small task, and it's actually not without dangers and risks, but I think that's really our job. If there's anything that's kind of helpful about looking through the history of Jewish lefts, one of the really nice things about reading Jewish left of the 1940s, particularly stuff from communist-aligned and Trotskyist-aligned groups, the JPFO, the IWO, the group I'm blanking on, Yidburo, they talk a lot. Some of these organizations were still around. The AJC was there, the ADL was there in the 1940s. And they refer to them as bourgeois imperial organizations, right? And they see them as the enemy. They don't see them in any way as part of a kind of Jewish people in some kind of coherent sense. They recognize them as Jews, and I think we need to retake some of that language, right? They are part of the bourgeoisie against which we are opposed. And I think this gets to the last question about coalitions. So yes, I'm all for coalitions. Obviously, on the question of Zionism, I'm happy there are plenty of anti-Zionists who are liberals, and there's a growing anti-Zionist liberal sort of wing, you could say, Jewish progressive movement. And I think to the extent that we agree on Zionism, we absolutely wholeheartedly need to be in coalition and in good faith coalition, right? But there is a role that the left, I think, can play, which is to remind people that Israel does not exist and have the power exist because it's simply, a bunch of bad Jews or people who made bad decisions or read the Torah incorrectly or whatever, right? The reason that Israel has the power is because it is a client state of the most powerful empire that has ever existed in human history, that is the American empire. It is part of the circuits of capital, is part of the global flows of capital. It is the foot soldier of capital. And that is the reason it is, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, of the Americans, Seventh Fleet. And so in that extent, this is the fight not only against, Zionism in our own community, this is the fight against the American empire. And we need to be very clear about that. And so, of course, in a lot of questions, we don't need to put that up front. Every time we have a conversation about what's wrong with Jonathan Greenblatt, we don't have to say, this is the worst empire that has ever existed, blah, 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 blah. Actually, it's probably not. But anyways, this is this great global empire we're fighting. But I think that's our role, to remind people of that. And that also fighting capitalism on the shop floor is part of this as well, right? So it's no accident that Zionist organizations, the Zionist right in the Democratic Party is also anti-worker, also anti, doing things about the climate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these challenges exist throughout society. So I think that's a role I see as a JVP member, I see as a DSA member, I see as, a cultural historian of the left, et cetera. So, and as a Jew who's interested in the survival of the Jewish people as something other than fascists. So.
That is a good note to end on, I will say. Thank you both so
Well,
much.
Carl, sorry, my friend Carl has his hand up. Can we possibly, he's a real Spinozan, and we've amalgamated about Spinoza. So maybe we should shut him up, or else lest we be corrected. But I do want to give the last word to a real Spinozan if we possibly can. So.
Okay, I mean, I'm fine to stay a few more minutes if you two are. I didn't want to be presumptuous of your time.
For Spinoza, anything is possible.
I'm also, and I would also say for Carl, anything is possible. I love Carl's work as well. Carl's wonderful. So Carl, what do you got to ask?
Hi. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I've been enjoying very much what you've both been sharing. So this is actually a question that's not really about Spinoza, although you could make it about Spinoza if you want to. But it's a question I struggle with as someone who is both Jewish and a Marxist. And it has to do with the relationship between ideals and interests. Right. So Benjamin, you made this really nice point that for a long time, the Jewish left, for a long time, Jews were on the left, and definitely the left projects, because of a material interest in not being subjected to persecution. Right. So there was a material interest that Jews had for a long time that aligned them with leftist politics. And now I think it's fair to say, certainly, sure, we have these ethical ideals, these humanistic ideals that align with leftist projects. But I guess I might want to know, well, what is there in our material interests as Jews, or material interests as just people living in the world, right? That can do this role. It's like, are we just being motivated by high-minded ideals, right? Or is there something materialistic going on here? And I sort of raise this question because that's where I feel a tension between my Jewish half and my Marxist half, right? Because as a Jew, I want to defend humanistic ideals and all those great, wonderful, universalistic imperatives. But at the same time, as a Marxist, I'm kind of a materialist. So I feel this tension. I want to see if maybe you guys could help me address it or think through it a little bit. So thank you for that, if you can.
Yeah. Dania, do you want to go first? I don't know. I'm happy. I have thoughts, but
go ahead.
Okay, yeah. As my grandmother used to say, if you're not interrupting, you're not listening. So feel free to interrupt me.
I do always feel free. That's part of my answer, Carl.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and I think it's actually there's a real split, particularly on the left, but particularly in the Jewish left, about this question of material interests and Jewish whiteness, at least Ashkenazi Jewish whiteness. And how to think about that. And I tend to maybe overcorrect perhaps on the materialist side, and try to create a kind of, you could say, dialectical unity of the thing. So I would say two things. One, obviously, I do think Israel puts Jews at risk, and I think we're seeing that now. There's a rise of the far right that is increasingly anti-Semitic. And its anti-Semitism is absolutely legitimated, not just fueled, but legitimated by the feeling that many people have that Israel is this odious nation run by Jews, and there is now, this Jewish cabal running the world, right? And it's genocidal. And people like Candace Owens, people like Nick Fuentes, people like I have a hole in my head where Fox News host names should go, and probably it's best that.
Are you thinking of Tucker?
Yeah, thank you, Tucker Carlson. Yes. Anyways, these people, like I said, I think are gaining credibility precisely because they're taking stances, anti-Semitic stances against Israel, and pointing to Israel's real crimes. And so I think in that sense, and that endangers Jews, but also I think we have to think about the way in which anti-Semitism itself fuels the right, right? So, Jews might not actually be the victim of anti-Semitism, right? So we have a right that is incredibly anti-Semitic right now. And the most immediate victims of those are migrants, right? Because there's these kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Soros funding migrant caravans and things along those lines. But it will also come to I think, harm Jews. Theories about cultural Marxism, right? As a Marxist professor in Indiana, theories of cultural Marxism animating my state legislature makes me a little nervous. So particularly as faculty are losing their jobs everywhere. So I think there's that material interest. I think the other material interest is that still today, most Jews are not in the 1%, right? So Jews in America are pretty middle class. Maybe the educated middle class, but they're pretty middle class. And I think there's a reason why the bourgeoisie aligns itself with the ADL and aligns itself with Israel, because it defends their class interests. And so I think one can, when we're talking about coalitions, one of the things that's really nice, again, to think about history, and you say this is one of the sort of things that the old left got right, is that they did a lot of theorizing about what it means for the middle class to align itself with the working class. This is kind of the theorization of the Popular Front, right? And they basically made the argument that yes, most middle class people may think of themselves as privileged, they may be educated, but at the end of the day, they work for a salary, and that their public jobs, whether it's at universities, at high schools, as social service workers, et cetera, are reliant on a liberal state, right? That defends on some level the kind of social provision. And Jews are actually overrepresented in those fields, overrepresented in the fields of education, overrepresented in the fields of social work, overrepresented in kind of liberal NGOs, et cetera. And these are all organizations that are under attack right now. So I think there's a very clear material interest in most Jews, at least most middle and working class Jews, in being anti-Zionist. And then, of course, there's the interest as well. It just feels awful and odious to think that this thing I grew up with, enjoying, I actually, weirdly enough, like being Jewish. I felt these warm, fuzzy feelings, at the Seder table growing up, and going to temple with my atheist rabbi. I really enjoyed that. It was one of the few normal places I could go as a youngster in a small town in California and have nice adults, who would talk to me. And so yeah, it's a daily catastrophe to think that is somehow now being taken over by this, again, kind of Zionist death machine. So I think there's a lot of material interests that, to me, are very important for, I think, a Jewish left to be able to articulate.
I am not nearly as erudite as Benjamin at this hour. So I would say that, first of all, this sucks. I mean, not this is awesome, but like this moment in this timeline is terrible. And I think it's in our material interests to have it be different, no matter where we are, like in the, normal person to sub-tech overlord, neo-reactionary death monster continuum. So I guess if you are a tech overlord, neo-reactionary monster, and on this call, you should give a lot of money to ACJ and then maybe stop doing whatever it is you're doing. But the rest of us do have an expanded class interest. And this is where I find, stretching the ideas about who is the working class and who, like, maybe I'll back up and say that in my experience organizing across workers, communities, and small businesses and others, that my previous understandings of who's in the working class and what our interests are, or what their interests are, have changed as the political economy has changed, and as the and so I feel much more than I did when I was a baby union staffer that my material interests are absolutely bound to the improvement of conditions for, say, Amazon workers in warehouses, and as did the tech workers at Amazon. And that it's not only their ideals and not only their political commitments, but actually it's those kinds of solidarities that make possible the kind of tech organizing in their own interests, that all of those beginnings begin with solidarity with others and then become their own self-interest. And so that's very instructive to me. What that means to me as a Jew, I don't know, but that's why I go to synagogue and I think about it, but or I ask Andy. But I do think that it does feel increasingly clear that if we are going to be able to continue to make Judaism, especially Judaism that's not, genocidal mania, we will need a different political economy. And that too feels in my interest. And so I hope, Carl, that is some answer to your very big question. The true answer is, I have no idea, and we should probably figure it out together.
Since we went over for one question, we should probably go over for Carolyn as well, if you guys can stick around for it. So Carolyn, love to hear your question too.
Thank you very much. It was really a question for Benjamin, because I've been doing a lot of reading on the communists of the 1940s. Before that, I was also doing a lot of reading, by the way, about the ACJ, and I'm very interested in the ACJ. But I was expecting something quite different from the communists, from what I found. And what I found was reading through the Daily Worker and reading through Jewish Life. They were incredibly pro-Israel. And even though they considered themselves anti-Zionist, and they defined that to mean that they did not believe that Zionism or founding a Jewish state would solve the problem of anti-Semitism, like other communists and socialists, they thought that socialism would solve it. But in spite of that, they were very, very pro-Israel and very partisan in their reporting on and understanding of, for instance, the 1948 war. For them, Palestinians were basically invisible. So I'm wondering, since Benjamin has done so much more work in this area than I have, if he can comment on this or help me in any way to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So if you go back a little bit further, so one of the wonderful things about the best part and the worst part about the Communist Party was that it was tied to the Comintern, the Communist International, which was to greater and lesser degree at different points in history directed by the Soviet Union. And so, there's more of a give and take relationship. The American communists actually, particularly in the late 20s, particularly Black American communists, had an enormous role in reorienting the Comintern towards the Black struggle in the United States and also towards anti-imperialism. And so there's a period from the 1920s up until really kind of the 1947, in which the official communist line is anti-Zionist. So if you actually go back to 1938 and look through the Jewish press, Jewish Life gets founded in end of 1946 or the beginning of 1947, I can't remember which. But if you go back to the Jewish left press, particularly Jewish socialist press, in the late 1930s, there was, of course, this big debate about the Hebron uprisings. This is basically 1937 to 9, I think. There's a series of them. And the Communist Party got in a lot of trouble for basically backing the Palestinians. And they said that this is legitimate anti-colonial revolt to attack Jewish settlers. And there's a number of articles in the New Masses, in Yidburo, in Morgan Freiheit, which all precede Jewish Life, which support the Palestinian liberation struggle. What changes after World War II, and particularly in 1947, is the Soviet Union. So Stalin, as you probably know, was a horrifying anti-Semite. And as he was backing the state of Israel in 1947, was also executing the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in the Soviet Union and dismantling the Soviet answer to Zionism, which was Birobidzhan. And executing all of its leaders. So Stalin's a real piece of work. In fact, actually, I would argue that he was probably the most consequential Zionist anti-Semite in world history, probably even more consequential than Balfour or Churchill. In any case, so the Soviet Union recognizes, I think, very clearly that after World War II, there's going to be a scramble for the Middle East, and the Soviet Union recognizes that Israel is the Yishuv is the best armed, best trained, and meanest organization in the Middle East in the late 1940s, and decides to ally with Israel, basically to try to bring Israel into the Soviet camp. And so if you follow Jewish life through the late 40s and the left press, there's this real change that happens. So in 1946, the line is still anti-Zionist. And then in 1947, when Gromyko comes out to the UN and backs partition, the line changes, and then Jewish life changes on a dime and suddenly becomes this. And actually, a lot of Jewish anti-Zionists that I quote extensively become immediately pro-Zionist. So Biddleman also is one of them, who wrote these amazing things about Jewish life, Jewish culture, anti-Zionism, and then the Soviet Union changes his tune. And as a good communist, he changes his tune. Howard Fast is the same. Interestingly enough, the one person that does not change his tune is Mike Gold, but he shuts up and stops talking about it. Yeah, and there's that is the absolute tragedy. And actually, I would say one of the things that really legitimated Israel on the left really was the Soviet Union. And it's funny for us to think now the Soviet Union had any kind of credence or importance, but to leftists and even to liberals, the Soviet Union, you have to remember, in the 1940s, won World War II. They defeated the Nazis, right? They liberated Auschwitz, and you know, Khrushchev's revelations were not known yet. So you know, the gulags were not necessarily something that was part of daily conversation. So the Soviet Union had a lot of credibility, even among, again, liberals, and that's the interesting thing. If you read, like, even The Nation magazine, right? There was a lot of kind of pro-Soviet sentiment. They were allies in World War II, et cetera. And, you know, even people like the Rosenbergs, you know, who went to spy for the Soviet Union, he really thought, you know, that he was spying for the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis, you know, in the 1940s. He did it during the war. He did not think he was being a traitor to the United States or anything along those lines. So the Soviet Union, again, had a lot of credibility. And so when the Soviet Union backed the state of Israel, that really decided the question for a lot of Jewish leftists. If the Soviet Union says it's good, then I guess that is. And yes, they made Palestinians invisible and you know, forgot about all the stuff they wrote about Palestinian liberation in the 1930s and early 40s. Of course, the Soviet Union changed its tune again in the mid-50s, definitely by 1956. And then, of course, by the 60s, the Soviet Union is clearly in the anti-Zionist camp and is funding, you know, the PLFP. And so, of course, there's, again, this kind of consensus that emerges on the left, the Jewish left, the non-Jewish left, by the mid-60s, that Zionism is part of the Western Empire. But yeah, it is a real tragedy. It's actually incredibly painful to read these same Jewish authors who, you know, several years before were writing all this anti-colonial material suddenly change on a dime. There are many groups that did not change. So, you know, for instance, if you read the Trotskyist press throughout the 1940s, Hal Draper, the other person I'm blanking on right now, Trotsky himself, before he was murdered, you know, remained basically anti-Zionist, and you know, basically one of their big criticisms of the Communist Party was that not only they support the state of Israel, but, you know, the Jewish communists are dupes to this, you know, state that is doing things for its own geopolitical interests and not at the interests of Jews, et cetera. So there was still a debate after 1948 on the Jewish left. It just got a lot narrower and smaller. And the last thing I would add also, too, is that 1948 is the beginning of the Red Scare in the United States. And Jews are just kind of shutting up about stuff in general, right? Or then their organizations are being banned and silenced. And Israel really kind of falls off the front pages of the left press, with one exception, which is William Zuckerman, and who wrote the Jewish Newsletter. The Jewish news, so Zuckerman was a non-aligned Jewish socialist, Yiddishkeit Jewish socialist, much like in, I would say, temperament, personality, politics in many ways to Jewish communists, but was just not a member of the Communist Party. And he ran the Jewish newsletter throughout the 1950s, which became this kind of hub of Jewish socialists. I would also say anti-Zionism, but criticism of Zionism. So I wouldn't say that Jewish socialist anti-Zionism died with the Stalinist switcheroo in 1947. It continued as a force, but Zuckerman dies in 1961 or 62, and the newsletter dies with him. And so it gets picked up again, in the 1960s. So there's two ways of looking at it. You can look at this kind of embarrassing, horrific, painful switcheroo that really changes, I would say, the Jewish left and its relationship to Zionism. Jewish Life becomes a Zionist publication. Morris Shabbos, becomes a Zionist. But you can also look in the other way through these continuities. So Zuckerman, Hal Draper, the Trotskyists, up through the New Left, which emerges as anti-Zionist in the late 1960s. So, it's complicated. But yes, Jewish Life became an embarrassing publication in 1947 after Gromyko comes out with a speech, and it's just painful. It's incredibly painful to read. So.
Thank you. That was a very thorough rundown of the relationship between Zionism and communism. It's actually incredibly helpful to me because I didn't know any of it. So I'm grateful for you, your sharing all that. And Carolyn, I hope that answered your question. I think it did. So thank you all once again. Thank you for sticking with us as we went over and continued the conversation. And we're still trying to nail down what we're going to do for in this place next month. But keep an eye out. For those who are interested, we also just released our Adar Shabbat Haggadah. So if you go to our Instagram, you can find a link to download that as a way to kind of key in to Jewish praxis for your Shabbos over this month. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Dania. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.